Congratulations for making it to the semifinals rounds. My name is Cheng. I'll be your chair for the day. Paneling with me are
Hi everyone, I'm Rayner. Pronouns he, him. All the best for the round. Good luck.
Hi everyone, I'm Alysha. No preferred gender pronouns, just refer to the panel as a whole. Good luck.
yeah. So on OG we have Light. On OO we take our POIs personally. On CG we have ChulaMahidol, Reyes, and on CO we have David and Michael. For the motion, the House believes that all developing nations should issue compulsory licenses to local pharmaceutical companies. Welcoming Prime Minister, here.
All right, so no preferred gender pronouns. You can call me anything, I will not be offended. POI, preferences, specifically voice. So if you have any POIs, just turn on your mic and POI me. If I do not take it, please do not badger me. Yep, that's about it. So starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Now, my speech will be structured as such. First, I'll give you the keywords and specifically why the keywords matter in this debate. Next, I'll tell you the status quo and specifically why we have to implement this motion. And last, I'll give you our arguments on why we should win this debate. Right, onto the keywords. First, we tell you the most important keyword is developing nations. What do developing nations look like? They look like have weak economies. They have resource allocation is severely limited when you're a developing nation because you generally have lower levels of economic development. You have lower per capita income, you have lower GDP, and you have less industrialization in your world. So the access to basic service such as healthcare, education, clean water, and sanitation will be limited and or unevenly distributed in developing nations itself, which results in like disparities in living conditions and quality of life. So like the significant proportion of the population in these developing countries will be living in most likely poverty, or like at least they are facing challenges related to things like inadequate nutrition itself, housing, or like economic opportunities. Now, what does compulsory license specifically mean to you in OG? The only condition allowed inside site opening government is public health emergencies. Nothing other than that will be issued compulsory licenses to pharmaceutical companies except for public health emergencies, and after that it will be revoked once the public health crisis has been has cease to exist anymore. So the status quo of this is when during public health emergencies, the medicines will see a surge in demand. So basically, if you have learned economy before, you know the concept of supply and demand. When demand goes up, basically, and when your supply is low, we tell you that the prices of this medicine will skyrocket. Rich people are willing to pay more for medicine as well. Therefore, they are excluding the more poorer class individuals from obtaining suitable medicine itself. So developing nations, they also have like limited financial resources, and they also have budget constraints. So they cannot subsidize medicine because it can be costly, especially during a public health crisis when the demand for healthcare services and supplies itself is very, very absolutely high. So governments will struggle to allocate sufficient funds to cover these subsidies without straining their budgets itself. So like the only method where these developing nations could actually get enough money to like subsidize is like by borrowing money from other countries. But note that developing nations already have like high levels of debt or like limited access to international credit markets. So while borrowing to finance medicine subsidizes during a crisis is not a viable option at all for them, because it will come with unfavorable terms that further burden the nation's finances and basically put the nation further into debt. Therefore, we're telling you by providing compulsory licenses to local pharmaceutical companies, we increase the current supply of medicine in the market, therefore successfully lowering the price, plus we make it more accessible for everyone. Our burden on site OG is simple, right? If we can prove to you that the accessibility of cheap medicine is important during a public health crisis, we win this debate on the metric of scale on who we help more, and which is the individuals and the citizens on the ground. Now, the argument here is simple. We tell you that only on site OG, we have the principle of saving lives due to the affordable access to medication. Pharmaceutical monopolies and high drug prices happen inside opposition. We tell you that the global pharmaceutical market is characterized by a lack of competition due to things like monopolies held by multinational corporations in the pharmaceutical market. These patents grant exclusive rights to produce and sell life-saving drugs, which often leads to things like inflated pricing that places essential medicine out of reach for many individuals, particularly in developing nations. Like a really simple example is like the COVID-19 vaccine, right? Like a lot of developing nations in our current status quo, they cannot afford to buy like COVID-19 vaccines just because like they cannot make it do so. So like we tell you that when MNCs in the pharmaceutical area, they have monopolies, they are prioritizing on profit. So they will set things like more higher prices for patented medication to recoup research and development costs. So like this profit-driven approach, it creates significant barriers to access for patients in need, as they cannot afford like the high cost of treatment, and even the country itself cannot afford it. So we tell you this leads to things like disproportionate impact, because high drug prices, they affect vulnerable and marginalized population in developing nations, which exacerbates more health disparities and perpetuates more cycles of poverty and ill health. Comparatively, in our world, we have competition due to the increased amount of suppliers in our current market, which leads to things like lower prices because you want to competitively gain an edge, or actually like get sales rather than not get any sales at all. So competitive prices will further push down the price of this medicine downwards, therefore leading to what we say is a more affordable healthcare. And next, we also tell you that access to healthcare, including essential medicines, is recognized as a fundamental human right in international agreements. And all governments in the world have a moral and legal responsibility to safeguard this right for their citizens. And the only way that governments in developing nations can actually do so is by actually issuing compulsory license, like how I've proven to you. If not, side opposition has to prove to us how accessible healthcare is going to happen in their world. If not, we take this point. Ensuring affordable access to essential medicines has severe critical implications for public health and societal well-being. We tell you on the first metric is that we reduce mortality and suffering, right? Because the access to affordable medicine, they save life and reduces suffering, and it's kind of obvious because there's more wider access, less people are going to die, and basically your GDP can continue being flourished because you have more manpower in your world. And we tell you that we focus on every single individual, right? And the next metric is that we more preserve the public health, because compulsory license for local pharmaceutical companies, they play a crucial role in responding to health emergencies such as pandemics, epidemics, or sudden outbreak of diseases, where this argument basically underscores the importance of timely access needed to essential drugs during crises. Now, before this, I'll take a POI. 3, 2, 1. All right. So the rapid production from these pharmaceutical companies, they often require a swift response to produce and distribute life-saving medication to a lot of affected populations, especially when you talk about developing nations. You have places like more rural areas, which are more isolated from the city center. So we tell you that only in this pharmaceutical companies, they have situated local pharmaceutical places, they are more likely to produce these types of medicine, and to more likely to be able to distribute this type of medicine to people closer to their surroundings, compared to the government having to reach out to a lot of logistics and actually try to over 6 minutes. Okay, so we tell you then only in our world we get more accessibility only for these people who are living in rural areas, and therefore we tell you that we protect the vulnerable population in this debate. So it is the compulsory license that ensures that these communities have access to essential medication, because just to tell you that we can actually provide these medicines to these people more effectively, due to the basis that more local pharmaceutical companies are going to be able to provide for these people, as compared to an entire multinational corporation or the government itself. And therefore, please say 4G.
Thank you, PM. Welcoming to the floor. Hello, here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
My preferred pronouns are she, her, and I prefer my POIs verbal. And wait a second. And I'd like to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. As opening opposition, we understand that we want to improve healthcare as medicine, but we believe that compulsory licenses are flawed and is a counterproductive solution. We will be explaining why in our speech. But before that, let's start with some rebuttals. Now, we both agree that developing countries are a country that does not have a lot of money nor funding to be improving and putting monies into the healthcare. However, even though we will be providing these licenses and how governments at how it will be increasing supplies, but then how are the local pharmacists going to be able to afford to even make these medicines and treatment in the first place? Because it's not just only about the ideas, but it's also about the process, the technology that's going to be used in developing countries, as well as local, keyword on local, does not have the money or the funds to be doing so. And even if they're able to have the how-to, does not mean that they'll be able to create these drugs. Moreover, so there will be other unintended consequences that developing countries does not need, causing more harm than good, and we'll be explaining all of these in our argument. Local pharmacist companies have lesser resources in terms of both experience, personnel, financial rescues, and being technology equipped. However, now that all pharmaceutical companies local have access to this compulsory license, they have the incentive to create more profit before other companies by pushing out the drugs in the market first or selling them at a much lower price than competitors, especially in emergencies where people are wanting to buy the fastest thing that comes out, the fastest things that arrive to be able to save themselves. For many companies that might have a little more funding might be able to take advantage of that using low-cost production methods to substitute other technology, like maybe even slightly adjusting the drug's recipe and substituting with cheaper ingredients. And why these lower ingredients can go into market to customers, check balances in these developing nations may not be as strict, and maybe especially as Food and Drug Organization not as thorough, and these low quality drugs can go out into society and create possible harm for these citizens who does not even know. It is important to know that these citizens in developed countries likely did not have access to these drugs before, or not familiar with taking drugs, or is it susceptible to pharmaceuticals to be taken advantage of them. These people might not even know what will be put inside, or maybe they can slightly adjust, like I said, and creating bad and low quality drugs that might even cause more harm than goods to our developing people in the nation. And when it does, how will these people be able to deal with that? How will we be able to fix these low quality drugs that are going out into society? And even if this possibility does not occur and the government tries to claim that there are external forces which leads to the creation of quality drugs, we argue that it is still a lead to monopoly from even foreign accesses or richer pharmaceutical companies. Developing countries likely have lesser strict trade or foreign policy restrictions, which makes them more vulnerable for foreign invasion. Foreign investors can see this as an opportunity and use to gain some sort of powers. For example, they could partner with local pharmacies by giving them financial support and resources. Foreign investors can come in with influence and produce drugs and bump up to exorbitant prices to gain profits. At best, these prices are symmetric on both sides, but on their side, compulsory licenses and intellectual property are being taken advantage of. These people could just come in and, like I've said, partner and create these drugs and take advantage of the compulsory licenses system. And at worst, there is also the possibility of low quality drugs that creates long-term harm for the well-being of citizens in developing countries and nations and are harder to pinpoint from the nation's government, and it can also lead into the cycle of never-ending health emergencies. More than that, it can even create lack of innovation, because developed countries obviously have very little money and probably need of funding and research maybe from companies, and obviously companies want profits, while making compulsory license available even if in an emergency. But in a country, in emergency healthcare is obviously where these drugs and medicine are going to be selling the most. It also creates uncertainty and reduces the potential returns on investments. People wouldn't want to invest as much knowing when there's an emergency, it can just be lifted. And when it's lifted, these people will already have the how-tos of creating that. It doesn't matter if we're putting it back on after these emergencies. It can lead to a decline in research funding and a slowdown in the development of new drugs and treatment in general. It can slow down the process of creating new medicine and development of healthcare in these developing countries that are very, very needed. Very, very needed. We believe that at our worst, we would still have these companies for creating drugs and developing their integral ideas on their own, but at our worst, we'll still be able to have these. But even though they're at their best, although everyone might be able to access these compulsorily licensed, but that doesn't mean that these local companies will be able to create a fair and a price for these developing countries' people to be able to have. And there are also, like I've said before, unintended consequences that can be happening that can cause a lot more harm to these people who doesn't need more harm than it already is. Especially when these, maybe it's low drug qualities, or maybe just a strip and bit that can simply kill someone, or that can greatly affect some people. And all of these combined, there are so much unintended consequences, and therefore this is why we proudly oppose.
All right, thank you, leader of opposition. Welcome to the floor, VPM.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, here's how I'm going to be structuring my speech. First off, I'm going to be dealing with the two major claims that came up in opening opposition. That first off, that you can't be able to afford, like pharmacists aren't going to be able to afford like the production process when it comes to making these medicines. And the second thing then is that all companies are now suddenly going to abuse the system, and there's now suddenly going to be this whole abuse of drugs, right? And then afterwards, I'll be responding to the two major arguments. First argument that they mentioned was about the abuse of drugs. Second major argument was about how it's suddenly going to be a lack of innovation, right? I think, okay, so like first off, the first thing that I'm going to prove to you is how then are they going to be able to afford to make this medicine, right? I think it's simple, right? Because I think first off, I'm not sure why they're suddenly trying to assume that governments are not these things are not going to take into consideration the pharmacists and suddenly make everything free. I think that's an unrealistic thing for them to be able to assume. Obviously, yes, obviously these pharmacists are still going to gain some form of a profit in order to be able to sustain their business and whatnot. However, what we're going to do is we're going to reduce the price. So it's basically going to be like a middle ground for the people as well as the pharmacists. So we tell you this is an unrealistic burden to prove. Second thing they tried to tell you is that companies are now going to abuse this system. Panel, no, their only layer of analysis like for this argument is the fact that, oh, you know, now because drugs are basically cheap, and because now there's like a world crisis, now like major companies with a lot of like tools and whatnot can now like, you know, create these like cheap products and just fake their way through. First off, I'm not necessarily sure as to why this is even remotely exclusive, because the only analysis to prove why then this is true is the basis that the world is going into a crisis. I think insofar as opposition doesn't do a good job of showing this, we tell you this claim is out of the way. But I think second thing, right? Because I think here's the thing. Even if there's like a lot of competition, right, which I think is the another like major source and reasoning for this claim, I think comparatively in our world, competition exists due to an increased amount of suppliers in the market, right? And I think this will lead to lowering prices, like to competitively gain an edge / actually get sales rather than not get any sales at all, right? So I think we already tell you that by lowering prices, you're still going to get sales firstly. But secondly then, competitive pricing further pushes the price of these medicines downward, right? Therefore leading to more affordable healthcare. So I think we tell you then that like even if companies abuse this and reduce the prices really quick, we tell you it's more likely to be able to gain any benefit. And the one harm that you have on your side of the house is something that is just basically exclusive and can be done by all things. Moreover, I'm also not necessarily sure as to why then like policeman, like occasional checkouts and the FED does not exist in order to be able to prevent things like this. So we tell you that this claim itself is also out of the debate, right? So I think let's just now that we've just dealt with the three claims, before I continue, any POIs? 5, 4, 3, 2.
Yes, yeah. Obviously there's still things like a very high barrier to entry. There's obviously still things like lobbying. As far as those things exist, we think it's still going to be likely very monopolistic competition, which means that prices won't decrease, because instead of a global like monopolistic market, it'll be just a domestic monopolistic market. What changes under your side?
Okay, I'll explain. I'll basically explain this later on. I'll basically explain this later on in my speech, right? But I think now let's just deal like the second argument here really quick, right? About a lack of innovation, right? I think first off, I'm not necessarily sure as to why this is true. In fact, I think it's comparatively going to be better. Because now when like this, I think as we mentioned before, now when there's like this huge crisis and whatnot, where companies are now forced to be able to try to think of like legit solutions to up their competitors, I think we tell you then this is only going to create further innovation, right? First thing. Second thing, I think we also need to realize that in the context of this argument, or in the context of in this debate, there's going to be like a health crisis or something going on. I think insofar as this premise is true, we're still able to tell you that there's going to be an innovation. There's going to be a want for innovation because not only is there an urgency to be able to get some business, but B, there's also the urgency in order to be able to save lives and etc. So I think we tell you that the lacking of innovation in argument is false with these two premises, right? I think insofar as this premise is true, we tell you it's going to be fouls on your side of the house. Mainly on the basis that when basically drugs are at an extremely high price, companies don't really have an incentive to do this due to the fact that they're already doing good, due to the fact that they're already making massive amounts of profit. And this is taking them at their best case scenario, they're already making massive amounts of profitization. So we already tell you then that a lacking of innovation, now at least we provide them some form of an incentive to do so, right? I think the second thing I want to talk about here is that vulnerable and marginalized populations in developing nations are disproportionately affected during health emergencies, right? I think then compulsory licenses ensure these communities have some form of access to essential medication, right? So I think we already basically tell you then that you're still gonna have business and etc. Right? Now, I think now leading on to right? I think second thing I want to call out here, furthermore, is that health emergencies often require a swift response to produce and distribute life-saving medications to affected populations. Compulsory licenses empower governments to basically expedite the production of necessary drugs, significantly reducing the response time. So I think we already tell you as to why the lack of innovation is not likely to come true. Now let's go on back to the abuse of drugs, basically, right? Because outside of the reasoning that I provided to you, I'm really still the only analysis they provide to you is that companies now are going to big companies are now just going to abuse this because they have the necessary resources to be able to do so. But I think, as explained before, we already have the FED and etc. in order to be able to prevent this. Before I continue, any more POIs? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Engagement noted. No more POIs now because it's past 6, right? Okay, I think here's then the extension that I'm going to provide to you, right? Because I think here's what basically my PM has basically told you, right? They basically told you why accessibility is extremely important, right? Basically. So I think here's now I'm going to extend on this by telling you why then we win on the principle basis in this debate, right? I think here's the thing. We tell you that it's morally incorrect to let these people die for no apparent reason. These people genuinely have lives and etc. I think insofar as this premise is true, we tell you the principle of saving lives is extremely important for a few major reasons, right? One, it's the government and healthcare's duty in order to be able to do so. Two, we tell you the lives of people genuinely matter, right? And I think this is already ignoring the humongous pragmatical benefit of it, right? I think insofar as the government's duty as well as the healthcare's duty to be able to do so, we tell you then the comparative is on opposition's world, where even if you get the best case scenario, you're not able to save any life and you're not actually able to create any delta, right? And any so-called harm that they provided to you has basically we've already proved to you how it's effectively been a wash, and no panel how they provide no effective benefit on their side of the house. For all of these reasons, so proud to win.
Thank you, DPM. We're coming to the floor, Yellow.
Okay. My pronouns are she, her, and I prefer my POIs verbally because I cannot see the chat. And I'll be starting my speech then in 3, 2, 1. Panel, notice how side opposition does not have the burden to provide any exclusive benefits in this debate, because the whole crux of our case is that implementing this policy of issuing compulsory license in developing nations, especially during health emergency crises, can have harms that are tenfold of the status quo. And that is what we have been arguing, and the other side has been trying to minimize and ignore. Before I move on to anything else, I'd like to point out how they simply set aside the fact that when you are creating drugs, there is a high barrier to entry, in which my first speaker has already framed for you. Because again, in these developing nations, these local pharmaceutical companies likely have lesser resources in terms of personnel personnel, financial resources, or just technologically equipped innovations, because before this, they have not had a lot of chances to actually try to produce these drugs because of the license from international companies, or simply because their citizens do not have access to high enough levels of education. Therefore, this can further lead into monopoly, both from richer countries and from foreign investors, in which we have extensively argued in our first argument. And we argued in our second argument that it also leads to a lack of innovation, which is even more harmful in the long term when another health emergency comes up and the price and the monopoly exacerbates into the future. Before I move on to any extensions, here are some more rebuttals. They try to ask us that for companies faking their way through the system and providing these low quality drugs, how is this only exclusive on their side? We say then that on their side, with these compulsory licenses, these companies with malicious intents and profit incentives, especially during times of health crises where citizens will literally take access to any drugs that they have in hopes of giving survival to themselves and their family, especially if it is sold at a low price, in which these companies can only do so by producing lower quality drugs that remove the production costs, right? Because understand that even if you can create profit from creating massive amounts of drugs, the production costs and cost to entry in the first place are still high. And so to escape this barrier, there is a very real possibility of these companies slightly adjusting the medicine or slightly removing certain parts in the production process to greatly lower these costs and put these drugs into the market, especially in health emergencies where probably the Food and Health Organization has many other concerns to think about. In these developing nations, they likely have lesser strict restrictions, or even if they don't go through the legal process, they can do this through more illegal ways or just selling it out on the street and distributing it into communities. I'll take your POI.
Now, what is your counterfactual for accessible healthcare then?
The counterfactual on our side in the status quo, where we see that there is still a problem of people not getting enough access to medicine, but we argue that there are better alternatives rather than to put in place these compulsory licenses from these developing nations, because the harms are tenfold, and the harms that we have given you are a never-ending state of monopoly, possibility of low-quality drugs, and the long-term harm of low innovation into the future. To further elaborate on our monopoly point, they have not really given us a mechanization that can go against this, right? They try to say that also with in regards to the high barrier point, I'm not sure if I caught their point correctly, but they assume that the government will try to give support systems for these pharmaceutical companies to be able to produce these drugs. However, we question this likelihood since resources are already limited in these health crises. We say that monopoly can come from foreign developed nations, which might already have bases in the country from the developing theory, where these foreign nations are already extorting resources from these developing nations. Therefore, they likely already have the connections to actually partner with these local pharmaceuticals if they wish so too. And even if they create quality drugs because they are able to, because they do not have the barrier to entry, we argue against the fact that they will just create massive amounts and profit from these sales at a lower price. Because if it's a health emergency, we have seen instances of companies extortionately pushing up the price. For example, epinephrine in the USA, where the prices are extortionately high, even though it is likely a life or death situation, to gain profit and to extortionate the citizens in these developing nations. And the government doesn't really have anything to counter against this, especially when there could be possibilities of lobbying from foreign investors working hand in hand with the government to create these circumstances to keep these governments in power, especially in developing nations where there exists large amount of political instability. To summarize up our case, we have given you two arguments. And in the first argument, we argue that based on the premise of higher barriers to entry, these pharmaceutical companies have the incentive to create low quality drugs and get away with the current system, and especially with the urgency of health emergencies, where citizens will take what they can get and hope for the best. And this can lead to long-term physical health effects for these citizens, and it can be harder to pinpoint coming from the government. We also talk about monopoly, both from richer companies within the country. We talk about lobbying and the possibility of foreign invasion. And in the second argument, we talk about the lack of innovation. For all these reasons, extremely proud to oppose.
Thank you, Yellow. And that concludes opening half of the debate. Opening up the closing half, welcoming member for the government here.
Can I check that I'm clearly visible and audible?
Yep.
Okay. I'll just get my timer up.
Wait, member of government is us.
Oh
No,
yeah.
we're member of closing, right?
Member of
Wait,
government is
Oh, sorry,
Chul-
sorry.
CG, yeah, ChulaMahidol, yes.
Oh, you gave me
Sorry.
a heart attack there.
It's my bad. Should have known. Okay, CG, whenever you're ready.
Okay, I'm guessing I'm audible.
Yeah.
Okay. POI is verbal. I'll try to take one at 5. If I forget to, I'll try to ask. Sorry. I'll try to stop and ask. If I forget, feel free to interrupt me. Pronounce he, him. Beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, in India, during the height of the COVID crisis, tens and thousands of people died every day because they simply could not afford to pay the exorbitant prices that foreign countries were charging for their patented drugs. If and when the country had just simply chosen to produce their own product, we think thousands of lives would have been saved. On a principle basis, we think that's incredibly easy already, but here we're going to prove to you why exactly this is the case. First, a free-floating rebuttal before the rest of my responses are integrated on this idea of barriers to entry. First, we don't think that it's fair for OO to place this debate in somewhere where there's absolutely no capacity for these developing nations to actually produce any drugs. Sure, we'll concede that maybe like if you're in the poorest nations in the world, maybe it won't happen. We think on that case, then no solvency will occur on both sides. So this debate should happen where there is a difference, where there is capacity. Note that not all developing countries are completely inadequate. Think of India, where they already do have some strong ability infrastructure. Additionally note that a lot of these developing countries can produce basic drugs already, such as like vaccines or whatever, or like any semblance of like medicine, and are not completely reliant on the global order because they probably want to like reduce costs, right? So we think that this debate can still happen within those countries and should not be swirled there. Moving on to the principle argument, while OGs already tried to push this principle, we don't think they did it to the sufficient degree. Why it's important? First, the citizens are extra vulnerable to the state because they have never chosen to be born within the state that they were born into. The birth lottery is inherently unfair, and they had no power to, and these citizens have no power to defend themselves. If they could have been born in like a richer country where they would have been protected, we think therefore it is the state's obligation to protect their citizens to the best degree possible, especially given that they impose lots of rules and regulations on them, such as taxation, etc. They restrict their freedom. Second, developing.
Hi, I'm really sorry, but my internet died out the moment you started your speech. So I was out of the debate. I was out of the call for quite a while. I'm sorry, but okay, I'm sorry about the recording too. But is it possible for you to off your camera and restart your speech? I'm really
Oh,
sorry about this.
So do I restart?
Yeah, I think did you hear any of the speech, Ryan?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Yeah, sure. I think it's fine if you restart.
Okay.
Yeah. So sorry about that. It's possible.
Oh, okay, sure.
Yeah, I think we just restart that.
Okay. Beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. At the height of the COVID crisis, tens of thousands of Indians died every day simply because they couldn't afford the expensive patented drugs of AstraZeneca. Note, before I get into my responses, I want to do a free-floating response of this idea of barriers to entry. Understand that this debate is inherently unfair when OO tries to frame it in only countries where countries are unable to produce any drugs at all. If that is where they want to place this debate, then we think they have no solvency on either side because those countries presumably don't have any ability to distribute the drugs regardless and are completely reliant on foreign aid. So it's unclear to me why it's important, why those countries should be within this debate. Rather, we think that this debate should happen within countries that do have some capacity. Countries like India, where they do already have the capacity to create drugs, right? I think a lot of developing countries also have this capacity insofar as they can create simple drugs such as flu vaccines or other things, right? If a country can produce flu vaccines, we don't see why it's impossible for them to produce COVID vaccines, which are both viruses, right? Moving on to my principle. First, the countries there's an inherent unfair. States have an obligation to protect their citizens because of the unfair birth lottery imposed onto the citizens who are also restricted by the state and impose unfair regulations onto them. They have an obligation to protect them any ways necessary. And if it includes producing vaccines outside of the patents of the world, we think that's completely fine. Second, developing nations have been historically oppressed by Western nations. We think that the regulations of these patents are inherently unfair and are generally made by WTO or other developed nations and have left out these developing nations within this rulemaking board. In other words, the developing nations did not necessarily consent to these rules. It's unclear to me why they have to play by these rules as well. The third principle here is simple. People are dying. We should probably save them. No. Okay, moving on to my practicals. Why is this effective, right? First, understand that patented drugs have large markups by foreign companies simply because they can. In times of global health crisis, think of COVID, right? When every country desperately needs your vaccines, you know what these companies can do? They can sell these drugs at auction. They either sell to Germany for $5 billion, or they sell the drugs to India at $5 million. Obviously, if you're the company, you would want to sell it to Germany first and screw the smaller countries because we all generally agree that these companies are profit incentivized, right? Note that local companies are unable to do this. They cannot just pick and choose countries. Maybe they can pick and choose a bit, but we think it's largely mitigated. And this is especially compounded by the fact that governments can also impose quotas or floor caps, right? Note that this does not have to be restricted by nature. A government can also produce the incentives, such as if you produce 50,000 vaccines, we'll give you a large bonus, right? Auctions and bids can be placed in order to incentivize these companies to actually produce low-costing drugs, basically subsidized even at a easier cost, right? Note that it's also harder for foreign countries to actually have these low prices because they have to distribute them overseas, or they have to deal with expensive bureaucracy and tariffs, etc. Additionally, right, so why is there no other alternative? If closing opposition wants to push, what if these foreign countries instead subsidize? This is unable to happen for a couple of reasons. A, there are political problems from the outside. These foreign countries might not be politically unionized to actually aid other countries directly, right? Right-wing politicians probably want to protect their own country first in times of a global health crisis like in COVID. Second, there's a lot of distance in ordering. It takes a lot of time for these drugs to come from overseas to these local areas, a lot of time where people are dying. Third, it's not localized. some citizens might not actually trust vaccines already, but they will trust it even less when it's made by like Sputnik or AstraZeneca, right? So, stuff like that. Moving on. Moving on to my next argument. Why is this likely to be done? Well, first, these politicians want to be voted in next time, so they have a lot of incentive to make sure that these drugs are healthy. Second, people will die immediately if it's really harmful. Like obviously there's a lot of backlash there. These companies probably want to make some money. C, there's a lot of oversight here. D, there's a lot of capital. Let's take them at the worst case scenario, right? Think of like what it really means to have like bad drugs, because insofar as like AstraZeneca is a superior drug to Sputnik, Sputnik still stops you from dying. The difference is just whether or not you contract the disease, right? Insofar as you still reduce the chances of dying, we think inferior drugs are still relatively good, and they're heavily unlikely to actually outright kill you. Moving on, why is it likely that innovation will still happen? 5 reasons for this. A, they still want to make money in the future, so they'll make these new drugs that they can make money off of. B, there's glory and PR bonuses when they cure COVID-19, right? Every company wants to be the one that cured cancer because it's probably good for their reputation and they can make a lot of money off of it. C, big pharma always has other cash cows. They don't need to rely on like one drug. If they need to make money so badly, then they can sell insulin at like incredibly high prices. D, there's lots of nationalization. These governments can always step in. 5, any long-term effects of innovation is largely outweighed because they may never manifest in the short term. At least our impacts are always there. Second, an actor analysis I want to do here is why companies are likely to do this anyway. A, there's a lot of marketing here. Everyone wants to be the altruistic company that actually like saved all these people, because B, you have a lot of market size here. India is a huge market for them. They want to make money in the long term. If they do this badly now, they might not be trusted in the future. No one wants to buy their other drugs, etc. The third thing I want to do here is analyze why there's unlikely to get backlash from Western countries for violating like WTO regulations. A, there's a lot of ideology by Western nations that they want to be like the superior country. Those, lead by example. They don't want to get the backlash of trying to sanction a country that's trying to save their citizens by just like making vaccinations. Second, there's a lot of competition. If it's not these Western countries that are being violated, China and Russia can step in. Other countries that are not aligned with them can step in and provide these drugs and ally with these developing nations. Developed countries, therefore, have an incentive to actually ensure that they're pandering to them and have them on their side when shit goes down. Why do we weigh over OO and OG? OG never properly analyzed the actors on why these drugs will be done well, why there's no backlash, and why there's no alternative. OO is largely long-term on terms of like innovation, and largely squirrels this debate into areas where it cannot possibly happen. We took it on a more nuanced level where it can happen, and we've proven that burden. For all these reasons, clear CG.
Thank you. Welcoming member of opposition. Thank you.
Is it better if I keep my camera off? I was just wondering.
Yeah, I definitely think so.
Okay. Okay. POIs in chat, please. I'll probably take on around 5 or 5:30.
Just to check, Rayner, you're still with us, right?
Hi, I'm alive. Yes.
Okay. Right. So if anything, just message quickly. Okay, that's it. Please go ahead, member of opposition.
All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. First key extension in this debate is about in what types of diseases are actually likely to spring up in these countries and what types of diseases that we're actually likely to talk about here, right? And the key framing here is to say that these diseases that likely spring up in these developing countries are most often going to be ones that are unique to these nations who like have a lack of sanitation, for example, have a lack of general infrastructure in ways in which, like, for example, high density housing leads to high amounts of contact between different people, and also where certain insects might be endemic. We see things in like malaria existing only in like many developing nations in Africa, in cases in which, like, for example, the medical infrastructure just simply doesn't exist to this extent. What does this mean? This means that, like, inherently it is unclear why these medicines are going to be unaffordable at the point at which these developing countries are likely to be the only purchasers from these companies, right? At the point at which these companies do not have anyone else to purchase to, at the point at which they make them, they ought lower it to a point at which it does become affordable to these people. Second clear piece of framing is that these medicines must necessarily exist in the first place, right? Patents cannot be gotten in advance. So it's incredibly unclear to me why CG's claim of like, oh, international drugs take ages to be developed and shipped exist as like in the case that like you can develop it at the same time as bigger countries, except like in the case that like no patent has been existent in the first place. What we're talking about is the cases where the medicine already exists, except now you're trying to make your own companies develop it instead of actually buying it from other people. I'll explain why these countries are likely to make bad decisions in my second point as well. What is the result of this? Note that global health crises as well, in another case, have further international sources like the WHO, which force resources to be shared, for example, like vaccines, right? So events like COVID, we think are firstly 1 in a million, and secondly, just symmetric on both sides. So like, and I think it's funny that CG's extension uses the example of India during COVID, where like the info slide literally exists in India, and this policy in India has existed far below the years of COVID, right? So we think that this impact probably just doesn't exist at all. And I think like the problem with COVID rather was that it's simply difficult to produce a vaccine in the first place. Like the development of a vaccine is incredibly difficult. And we think that if you force companies in India to try and develop it, even when it took literal months for like international, the best technology in the world, like brands like Pfizer and AstraZeneca, which took months, like these smaller local companies have no way of developing it at all. You are condemning so many people to die by not buying these drugs from other countries. What does this mean? Note that this nullifies the harm provided by government bench and breaks the top-off clash of OG saying, well, we can't get these drugs now. Like, outside can't get these drugs, and O's rather speculative responses in which they want to do it, right? The second clear impact of this is that brands with the most technological capacity are often the ones who can produce it the most quickly or are able to produce it at all. Often these things spring up like Ebola or things like that, right? Or things, or just like things which like it's very difficult to produce, in which cases like this otherwise like these countries will probably have developed something different already in the first place, right? So what we think that happens is that local companies also often do not have the means to create the adequate cures to these drugs, right? We look at things such as lack of capital, lack of technology, lack of knowledge. And also this is key to this extension in that it is without the precedent of more developed Western technology, right? In cases like COVID, like where you have no precedent of what types of drugs vaccines actually work, it takes everyone months, right? But at a point at which something already exists, it is much quicker to produce it. What this means is that like at the point at which these brands are now no longer likely to want to produce these things in the first place, when they perceive the government as just saying like, oh, we're not going to buy from you, they do not see this these sources of developing countries as a source of profit anymore. So in the first place, they never created. There is no precedent for these countries to go out of, which means so many more people die insofar as these companies do not have the types of capital required. This necessarily fills in the prerequisite premise to all of opening opposition stakes, and therefore we take it over them. Well, CG's response to this is say like, oh, well, some people have the capacity to do it. Note that the topic literally says all developing countries. We're not the ones picking and choosing. You're the ones picking and choosing in saying that you only have to support countries which do have the capacity, right? And note that our extension necessarily outweighs them at the point at which they only want to talk about countries that can produce drugs. If we're talking about the countries that do not have the capacity to produce drugs, it means that these countries are less developed infrastructurally as well, and these people suffer an even more intense harm than what any other than what GovBench want to talk about at all. Note that our benefits and note that in government's world, brands now notably have little incentive to invest in medicines when you are no longer guaranteed to have anyone buy it at all, when like what you make will just be stolen in the end as well. Note that in the comparative, brands have several positive and negative incentives to not price gouge. This is inherently responsive to all of GovBench. Firstly, competition, right? Like secondly, people are just going to die. Like sure, I'm willing to accept that these pharma companies are somewhat profit hungry, but they're probably not to the extent at which like they want to be seen as liable for people's debts. The distinction in our world is key in that they never make it in the first place. So they are not allowing people to die. They just simply don't have anything. They don't have anything to give away or like sell in the first place. Whereas in their world, they're actively withholding it by raising the prices so high. Thirdly, there's a lot of media backlash. This is an optical harm to their value as an investment and also as a company themselves. And fourthly, I think you just earn more money, right? If the country cannot afford it, they're not going to buy it, which means at the point at which these developing countries are basically your only source of profit from these drugs, you're likely to make it at a point where it is likely to be purchasable. Before 6 minutes, I'll take a POI from opening. Closing. No. Okay, the impact here is clear because people actually die because no drug adequately exists, right? These mechanisms are key to actually manifesting the benefits which OO claim and do not adequately prove. Second extension then on why developing countries are likely to cop a huge international harm, and this makes things worse on so many other scales. Firstly, I'd like to note that these like patents are likely to be these like compulsory things are likely to be issued badly. Like they don't have the art to say that this will be done well because this house believes that motion, right? 3 key structural reasons. Firstly, the definition of things like public health emergency is inherently variable. Like some countries have things like malaria which constantly exist. Is this a public health emergency when it consistently exists? Or like if 20 people suddenly fall sick, is this a sudden public health emergency by which you can now create your own drugs? And secondly, the conception of affordable medicine is also variable. Like what is affordable to certain people? By the characterization of government, these nations often have dodgy structures of like finance and things like that. They're likely to be corrupt, which means they're likely to do it badly. Instead of, for example, giving subsidies which cost them more money, this corruption is much more feasible and much easier. So like this means that many countries will also just do this badly. The first enormous impact is that a lot of development companies are already anti-West, right? They harbor an optimism bias towards their own capacities, even when they don't have the ability to create these drugs. It means that like now they have a precedent and another option that they will turn to at the point at which before all they could do is buy drugs off these countries, at a point at which now they're incentivized to try and create it themselves, which means that more people die, which means that so many people are left to die. Secondly, the other impact is that less people just invest at the point at which they perceive these countries as like denying IP laws, right? What this means is that like this optical precedent means that there is less investment, not only in the medical industry, but infrastructure. And in the long term, these harms are so much worse as well. For all these reasons, Sia.
Thank you, member of opposition. To close out government bench, welcoming government whip. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
All right. My name is Tate. I have no preferred pronoun preference. Please POI me verbally so I can hear your wonderful voice. Just because it's a recorded round and I may never get this chance again. Thank you, Mom and Dad, and shout outs to Sumit, Gift, Pacha, Ibrahim, and Sam. Time will start at my first word. My speech will be very simple. Responses to 2 benches, to opening opposition and to closing opposition. What we're going to show is like, we're going to just destroy all their like points and then hopefully just secure the victory. First of all, opening opposition attacks us on things like capacity and innovation. The idea that we can't produce any drugs because we're so poor, we're so malnourished and underprivileged because these societies have weak structures. But Aaron, I think rightly gives us a reality check. The idea that different countries like have different strong sectors in of itself. Like, and that India itself in the info side is just the perfect example of like a country that has like these health requirements over here. MO tries to push this further, but we really think that this is like a tough squirrel insofar as like when developed countries like do this, they're likely to not be stupid and likely to employ this in places where like it aligns to their strong suits. So if you have like a country that specifically like has nothing at all, we really don't think that it's reasonable for you to like burden push on this. But also note that there's an unproved burden from opening opposition on how exactly it's going to lead to monopolies when like, and the domestic industries can't compete over here. When Aaron has brought to you multiple layers of why like domestic industries like have like special like advantages over these like foreign companies. The idea of trusts, the idea that a certain brand name can be a tipping point to getting people to take like vaccines who read the news and maybe are afraid of the scary Chinese like COVID vaccine that seems shady. Having like a foreign drug being imported in here is just like a mental barrier that people can use to like break down. And when it's more accessible and when it's like cost free at the point in which you produce it yourself, we think that this is very easy. Secondly, like the idea of red tape, the idea of bureaucracy that just slows down like infrastructure or like slows down the distribution allows us to like get to these things faster, which is crucial in health emergencies, which we already talked about, where like time is of the essence. And finally, like the last transportation cost thing, like also like shortens this when you don't need to import a drug from super far away. It's just like locally in there. It's made to go and it's like ready to be shipped out. Note that this also like tackles CO's POI to OG when we talk about weighing the local side over the international side. But secondly, OO attacks us on quality. The idea that, oh, like we're apparently just going to like hand out meds like crack on the side of the road because like these government facilities are so shit. I think that you better rather give them some credit. What we're doing here from Aaron is like copying the exact drug formula. No, by opposition's own like standards of and framings of like these governments like having poor drugs, it's useful to say that the drugs that you're producing inside the local area are probably going to be like less quality than when drugs that are produced by ones that have higher governmental checks anyway, which means that like this quality is going to be inherently higher. No, like CEO tries to like attack this as well when it comes to like just not having like these governmental checks in place that allow you to do this. But we think that like by that own metric, these diseases of having like broad-based quality and broad-based like range is just like super important when it comes to this. Note that their whole case is mitigatory insofar as like they try to never let us like get our benefits at all, never get us to the point of trading off. But note that these like facilities just are able to like steal the best parts of like foreign eminencies and apply them to our side. And even in the worst case scenario, their counterfactual price gouging or their counterfactuals of like long-term health effects, we think that it's more important. Why? Because governments just don't want people to die. In the worst case, like it's better. Because from Aaron, like your side doesn't solve this inside the counterfactual either. Rent-seeking companies, like he provides you incentives for rent-seeking companies to sell to richer countries over the needy, which means that you can't access in the first place. Note that this also deals with CO's idea that like developed countries are supposedly this like big cash cow that you want to go to, but you want to like water it down and you want to like lower the prices just in order to like make it more affordable. Like insofar as like we do it more when we produce on our side domestically, nothing's going to change on your side. Like even though your prices in our worst case might be lower, ours are even lower because like we're able to like produce them here and because we have quicker access and much more able to like solve. Finally, like there's this point about innovation where it comes to like hurting domestic industries that again are supposed to be so malnourished that they can't make or distribute their own drugs. This is a response to themselves insofar as like when you recreate drugs, like oftentimes like you can use that information to learn more about them and expand your industry, making it more stable. We think that in the case in which like these industries like or these local industries just can't produce drugs in the first place, they might just not, but they don't have to. And in the case where they can, like not only is it like innovation going to be like the same in either way, but also like you actually get more of it. This is a different flip. Note Aaron's like massed amount of analysis about companies like barriers to entry and innovation breaking down, where like rent-seeking like companies want clout. They want to market. They see like huge countries like Bangladesh and see dollar signs in their eyes. This is exactly why they need to pay attention to these like places, or else they're going to get swept off the market. We think these incentives are so strong. They're so strong from CO that they're actually like unable to be swung even when our policy is going to be implemented. If our policies are so like hard to implement or so bad, then naturally you guys wouldn't care about like any of this because like you still would be the superior actor over here. But insofar as like you concede that this could be a problem economically, you concede the quality as well. Last chance for POIs before 6. All right. Last rebuttal to CO. What do they uniquely bring? They bring the idea that, oh, like unique diseases, like, oh, are unique to these places. And so you are able to like sell to them specifically. I don't think that like logically this gels over here. When it comes like as insofar as like people still probably get common colds, people still probably get like a bunch of different diseases over here. And insofar as like research is going to be like long and timely and cost effective and like drugs are going to pop up like new, which means that I don't think that there are very strong governmental or institutional incentives to make like these drugs if they are so periocal. If they are like in a faraway country that has no like money compared to like a rich country, we think that the drug makers probably make the most broad-based drugs. And note, these broad-based drugs like COVID vaccines that like target different types of like disease are likely to be able to like counter multiple different types of diseases, which is why like these drugs are so effective. And again, they say the competition doesn't drive it down the price, but I really want you guys to understand elasticity. I think it's really funny that like they say that people are going to die anyway on there, even if, when like you're willing to pay as much money as you can, what meager spendings you have to keep this over. But like for all those reasons, please propose.
Thank you so much, Government Whip. To conclude the debate for opposition bench and the debate in general. Opposition bench here.
All right, am I audible?
Yep.
Okay. I'll take POIs in chat. I'll probably take one in the 5th or 4th minute. CEO's extension was very simple. Diseases which affect developing nations often don't impact developed nations at all. Endemic bugs like mosquitoes and malaria, which is caused by that, literally does not occur in the developed world, but only in developing nations. Because of lack of sanitation, you see diseases that like many developed civilians don't even know about. Common colds weren't going to kill people. Malaria is one of the biggest killers in the developing world, and malaria would never be invested in. But cures to malaria would never be actually researched by these pharmaceutical companies if it was the case that these countries could just steal all their work and they could get not a single cent of profit. We think that this extension singularly actually proved the premise that was the necessary premise that proved the point of lack of innovation, and also defeated the affordability point, because it proved that these companies weren't trying to solve broad health problems, but they were actually trying to solve health problems specifically to developing nations, and that there was only one single buyer, therefore affordability wasn't an issue. I'll talk about two things in this speech. Firstly, on innovation and whether these pharmaceutical companies would continue to research into these specific diseases, and secondly on affordability. On the question of innovation, as I flagged in my introduction, we gave you that very specific framing, and we told you that because of this, affordability will be solved, but also we gave you the very important premise that was said by opening opposition about why these countries could get away with not actually investing in things like malaria or investing in things like developing nation-specific diseases, because often in the developed world, these diseases didn't even work, right? We also proved that developing countries relied on Western medicine, and that the fear of being subject to compulsory licenses meant that pharmaceutical companies just didn't even want to invest in this thing at all, right? What did the other teams say about this? Firstly, CG tried to say that there still would be innovation because companies still want to make money, right? Obviously, if there's no market for malaria tablets in the developed world, the companies have no incentive to make malaria tablets at all, right? Then they thought about how they want to have an image of being altruistic, right? This incentive, firstly, comes secondary to the profit incentive, we tell you, but also we think that pharmaceutical companies can get away with this, right? And we all by saying, oh, we're not going to invest in diseases like malaria because there is simply no profit for us now, because that question becomes much more palatable. Right? Then they said the government can step in. I think the broad framing that was agreed by OG was also that the government just can't step in because they're so poor, right? Then they and note also on innovation that this was probably upstream of everything that they said about affordability, right? And weighing affordability against innovation, right? The question of whether research into specific diseases could remain was probably the most important question. Why was this? It was because this question was logically upstream to affordability, because affordability was literally irrelevant when there aren't even drugs in the first place that people can access. People would die automatically. No one could be saved. Even if these drugs were a bit unaffordable, we would prefer that world, because at least in that world, people could save up for medication. In our world, there is literally no incentive for these countries to innovate into diseases that affect developing nations specifically, because their drugs would just be stolen by companies. And also, just secondly, we think that we also gave you just counter examples and alternatives about why affordability could be better. Moving on to affordability and why we went on affordability as well. The second extension we gave you at David was why there are significant alternatives that exist that mean affordability will still be good on our side. First, on competition, we told you that there often is competition and this drives down prices. Secondly, on image, right? And here we actually flip the point about how companies want to be seen as altruistic, right? Because when there is a profit incentive and these companies want to be seen as altruistic, they often will just lower prices for developing nations, right? To buy things like malaria tablets or buy things like COVID-19 vaccines. And thirdly, and most probably crucially, there are international regulators like the WHO, which means that companies can't stockpile vaccines, companies can't just price gouge medication, because there'll be enormous amounts of government, public, and media pressure, and as well as regulatory frameworks internationally that mean you can't do that, right? This answers the question of OG and saying oh, how do you solve affordability on our side? We've given you 3 counterfactual alternatives as to how we solve affordability and why there exists sufficient alternatives to solve affordability under our side, right? Okay, what did OG and CG say about affordability? The first claim of OG was that basically you're going to price gouge, these companies can price gouge, and because there is compulsory licensing, this increases competition. Within that, firstly, OO asserted that local pharmaceutical companies won't be able to produce these drugs to even begin with, right? This is true, but I'm going to actually mechanize this. Some reasons why. Firstly, I think there's a significant barrier to entry as has been stated, but also in response to CG specifically, I think the framing is that we don't have to prove that like these countries can't produce drugs at all. We simply have to prove that there still exists a monopolistic or oligopolistic market structure anyway. So right, so even if we like can see that, you know, some companies in these developing countries might be able to produce certain drugs, as long as there still exists a monopolistic market, affordability doesn't improve that much on your side. Secondly, note that like we also note that like there exists things like lobbying and enormous amounts of corruption in these countries, which means that corporate capture in these countries will often create monopolistic conditions and see like inelastic demand. Just flipping that point, this inelastic demand will stay the same. Companies can still price gouge. It makes no sense as to why there's changes, right? But we can see that there will likely be at least one or a couple of local pharmaceutical companies in these developing countries who can use compulsory licensing, right? But we think that the impact of this rebuttal is that it diminishes the scale of competition that OG and CG can claim under their side, because instead of an American company controlling the market, it will now be the biggest Indian company controlling the market. And we pointed this out in a POI to OG to no response. So affordability is very marginal, if non-existent. This means that OG's second point about how, you know, you can distribute to people in rural areas simply doesn't work and falls out. Obviously, rural demographics will still be ignored because it will still be a monopolistic market. Instead, we flip this, because if it's now Western companies distributing these drugs, they probably have the money and resources, like in terms of like transportation, to actually reach these remote communities rather than these own developing nations who don't have the necessary administrative or like, you know, transportation facilities, right? But the most damaging rebuttal to OG was their own extension, because if it was true that Western companies no longer had an incentive to even begin research on diseases that only developing countries suffered, because they could just, you know, because there was no incentive there, because all their research would be stolen by the government, we think that like affordability wasn't even a question that needed to be discussed. It was whether or not there would be drugs that these people could use. It's already 6 minutes, I'm sorry. What did OO say, and why do we beat them? Firstly, they talked about low quality drugs. I think this might be true in some cases, but I think it's more likely that under government's word, like our own extension is probably more likely. The reason for this is that like simply these countries probably won't even be able to like get low quality drugs at all, right? Because we think that in many cases, the reason why we're even having this debate is that often without the help of Western nations and without the help of Western pharmaceutical companies developing chemical formula that take years and years of research to develop, these developing countries and these developing pharmaceutical companies often have no means of getting these drugs. That is to say, as David proved to an extension, these developing pharmaceutical companies are incredibly reliant on Western medicine and Western formulas of chemical formulas and etc. to actually develop this. So there won't even be low quality drugs. It'll just be no drugs at all, and that is a terrible, terrible thing. Then they correctly identified this point about less innovation. OG responded by saying that this would only apply in health crises. David solved this matter by showing you how governments would do this in incredibly bad circumstances. Why was this? It was because there was a subjectivity of whether what constituted a public health crisis. It was because of corruption and lack of democratic transparency. For all those reasons, we think that basically we've proven that in the absence of like patent laws and in OG's world of compulsory licensing, there'll be no incentive for pharmaceutical companies to even invest in diseases that only impacted the developing world. For those reasons, vote CO.
Thank you everyone for the wonderful debate. Please cross floors, shake hands, and we will be announcing the semi-final results after deliberation. Here.
Cross. Where do we go?